The night Petra Sinclair told me I dressed like a woman who had given up, she was holding a glass of Riesling that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. She didn't lower her voice when she said it. That was the part that stayed with me afterward. Not the words themselves, but the volume. The deliberate, almost cheerful loudness of it, the way she turned slightly so the people nearest to us could hear. Her husband laughed. A short, surprised sound, like he hadn't expected her to say it out loud either, but wasn't entirely displeased. I was wearing a navy blue dress I'd bought on sale 3 years ago. It fit. It was clean. The hem had started to unravel at the back, and I'd fixed it with iron-on tape that morning in the bathroom of my apartment, kneeling on the tile floor with the iron plugged into the outlet by the sink, because that was the only outlet that worked near a flat surface. Petra knew none of this. Petra didn't ask. My name is Willa Harmon, and I had been invited to the Alderton Foundation Gala by my father, a man who, in the 41 years he'd been alive before I was born, had apparently never once considered that a daughter from his first marriage might find these events painful. He called it a chance to reconnect with the family. That's what the voicemail said. I'd listened to it 3 times in the parking lot of the grocery store where I worked part-time running inventory on the weekends, standing between my car and a shopping cart corral with wind coming off Lake Ontario that made my eyes water. I went because I was tired of being the one who didn't show up. The venue was a heritage building in downtown Toronto, one of those old limestone institutions that used to be a bank or a courthouse, something that handled serious things, and had since been converted into a place where serious money came to be seen. The ceiling was cathedral high. The chandeliers were the real kind, not the hotel kind, and they threw light down onto the room like something being poured. There were flowers on every surface, white and cream and the palest possible yellow, the kind of flowers that communicated restraint and taste and enormous expense. I arrived alone. I took the coat check ticket and folded it into my clutch. I found the bar. Petra found me first. She was my father's wife, his second wife, the real one, as she sometimes implied without saying directly. She was 53 and looked 45 in the specific way that costs money to maintain. Her hair was blonde in the way that required quarterly appointments. Her dress was the dark green of a forest in a painting, draped off one shoulder, and she wore it like she'd been born in it. She came toward me across the marble floor with her arms slightly open, in that gesture that looks like warmth from a distance and isn't, and she said, "Willa, you made it." And then, without pausing, without lowering her voice, "You really wore that?" The people nearest to us, a couple I didn't recognize, an older woman with elaborate earrings, all looked. I watched them do it. I watched their eyes move from Petra's face to mine, and then down, assessing. I said yes. Petra laughed, not cruelly, that was the thing. She laughed the way you laugh at a child who has done something accidentally funny, with a kind of fond bewilderment, and she said, "You always did have your own way of doing things." She touched my arm briefly with 2 fingers, and then turned back toward the room, and I was left standing there holding a glass of sparkling water I had not asked for, and which someone had simply placed in my hand during the preceding 30 seconds I drank it. My father was across the room, talking to a man I didn't know. He saw me, he raised his glass. He did not come over. I found a spot near the edge of the room, not hiding, just not actively participating, and I did what I always did at these things. I watched. I counted. There were roughly 200 people in this room. The catering staff were outnumbered approximately 4 to 1. The ratio of women to men was close to even, but the women were doing more of the conversational work, laughing more, nodding more, asking questions that kept the men talking. I'd noticed this pattern at every formal event I'd ever attended. I'd started noticing it at my mother's church fundraisers when I was 11. Numbers had always made more sense to me than people. I worked as a forensic accountant for a mid-size firm in Scarborough. Not glamorous, not the kind of thing you led with at parties in heritage buildings. But I was good at it in a way that was difficult to explain without sounding like I was bragging about something no one cared about. The kind of good that meant I could look at a set of financials for 40 minutes and know, without running a single search, approximately where the money had gone, and why, and when the person doing it had started to get sloppy. I noticed things. That was the long and short of it. What I noticed, somewhere around the 40-minute mark of standing near the edge of the Alderton Foundation Gala, was the man standing near the entrance to the east corridor who was not looking at the art. Everyone else was looking at the art, or pretending to. The foundation had hung a collection of mid-century Canadian painters along the south wall, and there was a particular group of 7-piece near the corridor that had drawn a small cluster of admirers. He was standing close enough to that cluster to appear associated with it, but his eyes had not moved to the canvas once. He was watching the room. He was tall, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that meant you had to look up slightly if you were standing next to him, which created a very specific social dynamic he appeared entirely aware of. His suit was the kind of dark that had no name beyond black, fitted precisely, no pocket square, no tie. He had a watch that I recognized as expensive from 10 meters away, the kind of recognition that comes from spending years reading financial records and learning incidentally what things cost. His hair was dark and needed cutting, or had been allowed to need cutting deliberately, and there was a scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, pale against tan skin, old enough to have been there for years. He looked tired. Not the way people look tired at 11 o'clock on a Saturday, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes and doesn't leave after sleep. He also looked like he was calculating something. I recognized that expression because I wore it often enough to know it from the outside. I looked away. I looked back at my glass. I was thinking about leaving. I'd been thinking about leaving for 20 minutes, running the social calculus of how early was too early, what obligation I'd discharged by showing up, whether my father would notice or care, when Petra reappeared. She had reinforcements this time. Her daughter from a previous marriage, Cassidy, who was 26 and worked in marketing and possessed the specific social confidence of someone who had never been asked to justify her presence in a room. Cassidy was wearing red. She had her mother's talent for volume. "There you are," Petra said, steering Cassidy toward me with one hand at the small of her back. "Cassidy, come tell Willa what you've been doing. She works with numbers." The way she said it, "works with numbers," was the same tone people use when they say "bless her heart." It meant something different from what it said. Cassidy looked at me with the careful friendliness of someone who had been briefed. "Hi, Mum says you're an accountant? Forensic accountant," I said. "Oh," a pause. "Is that like taxes?" "Not exactly. I look at financial records to find fraud. Embezzlement, money laundering, hidden assets, that sort of thing." Cassidy blinked. "Wow, that sounds..." She turned to her mother. "Does Dad know about the Cassidy?" Petra's voice cut cleanly. Then, to me, with a smile, "She's just impressed. It's such a specific little skill set, isn't it? Not a question. I always thought you'd end up doing something more." She tilted her head. "You were always so bright, in your own way." There, it was again, that volume. I became aware, in the particular way that you become aware of a change in atmospheric pressure before it rains, that the room had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just a degree or two of collective attention rotating somewhere nearby. I turned my head. The man from near the corridor was walking toward us. Not toward the bar, not toward the group of 7 painting, not toward any of the 200 people in this room who were objectively more visible, more polished, more architecturally positioned to receive attention than I was in my iron-taped navy dress. He was walking toward me. Petra noticed. I watched her notice. I watched something recalibrate behind her eyes, a rapid, involuntary reassessment, and I watched her begin to reposition herself slightly, shoulders back, smile warming by several degrees. He stopped approximately 2 feet in front of me. "Not Petra, me," he said. "You've been counting the staff-to-guest ratio." I said, 4 to 1, roughly. "They're going to run low on the canapés with the smoked salmon before 9. The charcuterie will outlast the event." Something shifted in his face. Almost nothing. The smallest possible adjustment around his eyes. "Lucian Varro," he said, not extending his hand. Just his name stated, the way people state things when they're accustomed to the name doing work on its own. I said, "Willa Harmon." Petra said, Oh, we were just talking about Willa's work. She's a forensic accountant. Isn't that fascinating? He did not look at Petra. I know what you do, he said to me. The room had not gone quiet. The room was still a room, 200 people, charcuterie, chandeliers. But something in the small geography of where we were standing had become very still. I said, "Do you? I had you looked into 3 days ago." Petra made a sound. I didn't turn to look at her. "That's a strange thing to tell someone," I said. "I find it saves time," Varro said. "Formality takes longer." "I don't have time." I looked at him more carefully then. The tiredness behind his eyes that I'd noticed from across the room. It wasn't fatigue, exactly. It was the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that they'd stopped noticing the weight except in moments of particular stillness. I recognized it. I'd seen it in myself in bathroom mirrors at 6 in the morning after nights of going through documents that didn't add up and knowing, before I could prove it, that someone had been stealing for years. I said, "What do you want?" He said, "There's money missing from one of my holdings, a significant amount. My own people have been through the books 3 times and can't find it, which means either my people are incompetent or they're involved. How much money? Enough to matter." "Everything's relative," I said. "Enough to matter to who?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more controlled than that. "To me," he said. And I don't say that lightly. I knew the name Lucian Varro the way you know the names of things at the edge of what you're supposed to know. Heard in passing. Read between lines in financial reports for clients whose business interests were themselves at the edge of what the law addressed and chose not to comment on. The Varro name appeared in incorporated holding structures in ways that were technically legal and deeply deliberate. He wasn't the kind of man who showed up on the news. He was the kind of man who appeared in the background of photographs of the people who did. He ran things. That was the cleanest version of what could be said. "I'm not available for private contracts," I said. "You're freelance on the weekends," he said. "I've already spoken with your firm. You'll be given a leave arrangement. The compensation is, I didn't agree to anything." "No," he said, "you haven't yet." He said it without threat. That was the part that made it harder to dismiss than a threat would have been. There was no pressure in his voice, no implication, only the quiet certainty of a man who had learned that certainty itself was the most effective form of pressure. I said, "What are the terms?" He told me. I told him I'd think about it. He said, "You'll say yes." He left then, walked back toward the east corridor, unhurried, without looking back. "Was that? Do you know who that is?" In a voice that had gone entirely different from the one she'd been using all evening, and I said yes, and finished my water. My father found me 20 minutes later, red-faced and slightly urgent. "Willa," he said, "what did Lucian Varro say to you?" He offered me a contract. My father stared. "Varro offered you." He stopped, tried again. "What kind of contract?" "Accounting work," I said. He kept staring. Somewhere behind his eyes I could see him running numbers of his own, a different kind of accounting, the social kind, trying to calculate what this meant, what my proximity to that name might mean, whether it was good or dangerous or both. "Your mother," he started. "Don't," I said quietly. He stopped. "You invited me here to show me your life," I said. "I came. I've seen it. It's very well lit. I got my coat check ticket from my clutch. Thank you for the invitation." I left before the smoked salmon ran out. I knew it would. The offices were in a building on Bay Street that had no name on the exterior. Just a number, clean and unbothered. The lobby had marble floors and a single security desk. The man behind it had the kind of stillness that wasn't trained in retail. I was taken up to the 14th floor in an elevator that didn't make noise. The office I was brought to had 2 windows facing south, a desk that was empty except for a laptop and a single glass of water, and Lucian Varro, who was standing with his back to me when I came in and turned when he heard the door. He looked less tired than he had at the Gala, or maybe he was better at managing it here on his own ground. "You're early," he said. "I wanted to see the building before I agreed to anything," I said. "And the lobby has good bones." I sat down without being asked. "Tell me about the money," he told me. It was a holding company called Meridian Asset Group. incorporated federally, with subsidiaries in 3 provinces. On paper, it was a property management firm. In practice, it handled financial flows for a network of businesses that ranged from entirely legitimate to considerably less so, and Varro made no effort to obscure this from me. He spoke about it the way you speak about infrastructure, with the plainness of someone who had long ago stopped apologizing for what kept things running. Over 18 months, approximately $2.3 million had been moved through a series of internal transfers in a pattern that was careful enough to have avoided 3 separate internal audits. It was routed through payroll adjustments, equipment procurement accounts, and a maintenance reserve fund that was technically active but practically dormant. I listened. I asked to see the books. He slid a hard drive across the desk. I opened the files on my laptop. The pattern revealed itself to me in the way that patterns always did. Not all at once, but the way a shape emerges from fog when you've been staring long enough that your eyes stop trying to make sense of individual details and start reading the whole. By the end of the 2nd hour, I had found the entry point. By the end of the 3rd, I had found the mechanism. By the end of the 4th, I had a name. Varro had said almost nothing during those 4 hours. He'd left the room twice, briefly. He'd brought a 2nd glass of water without being asked. He'd sat on the other side of the desk and worked on something of his own. And if he'd looked up at me, I'd been too focused on the screen to notice. When I said, "I have it," he looked up immediately. I turned the laptop to face him and walked him through it. The payroll adjustments that were fractionally too regular, not random variation, but a rhythm, the rhythm of someone who had set something up and then tried to remember to vary it manually and hadn't varied it quite enough. The maintenance fund, which had received a series of deposits from a vendor account that, on paper, was providing HVAC services to 4 different properties, and which I could confirm was not, because the properties in question were too small to have the systems the invoices described. The name on the vendor account was registered to a numbered company. The numbered company traced back to a home address in Mississauga. The director on file had the same last name as one of Varro's senior managers. I said the name. Varro was very still. I had been in rooms before when I delivered findings like this, to lawyers, to boards, to executives who had hired me, hoping I would find nothing and received the opposite. I had learned to read the stillness. There was the stillness of shock, and the stillness of grief, and the stillness of someone calculating rapidly what comes next, and the stillness of someone who had suspected this for a long time, and was now watching confirmation arrive. This was the last one. He said, "How long?" "The earliest transaction I can trace is 22 months ago," I said. "But the structure was set up before that. I'd estimate preparation started closer to 3 years ago." He stood up. He went to the window. He stood there with his back to me for a moment, looking out at the city below, and there was something in the set of his shoulders. Not defeat, but the weight of it, the specific weight of being the person responsible for everything in a room, and finding that that responsibility had been used against you. I didn't say anything. I'd learned when not to say anything. After a moment he said, without turning, "How does a woman who works forensic accounting end up at the Alderton Foundation Gala?" "My father's wife sits on one of their committees," I said. "It was not my idea. She spoke to you the way a person speaks to a servant they find mildly embarrassing," he said. Still not turned around. I said, "Yes. Did that bother you? Does it matter?" He turned then. He looked at me across the room with the same expression he'd used at the gala, that calibrated, assessing look, but closer now, and without the crowd around us. "No," he said. "It doesn't." He crossed back toward the desk. "You found in 4 hours what my own people couldn't find in 3 audits." "Your own people were looking for mistakes," I said. "This wasn't a mistake. It was designed. You look for a mistake differently than you look for a design." He picked up the hard drive. He set it down again. He looked at the name I'd written on the notepad beside the laptop. "What would you do next?" he said. "If this were your problem." "It's not my problem." Hypothetically. I thought about it. The vendor account is still active, which means he's still drawing from it. If you move too fast, he'll know you know, and there may be a secondary structure you haven't found yet. I'd map the outflows for another 60 days before you move. Let it run. Track where the money goes when it leaves Mississauga, and if he notices something is wrong before 60 days. Then he runs, I said, and you'll have to decide whether that's acceptable. Varro looked at me. Is it? I asked. No, he said. Then 60 days. He sat down on the edge of the desk, not behind it, on the edge of it, which changed the geometry of the room slightly, put us closer to the same level. He was looking at me in a way that was not threatening and not warm, that occupied some precise middle ground I didn't have a word for. You said earlier that you're not available for private contracts, he said. I said I'd think about it. You came. I was curious. Are you still just curious, he said, or are you interested? I looked at the files on my laptop, at the pattern I had found in 4 hours that 3 internal audits had missed, at the numbers that had arranged themselves into a story the moment I'd known how to read them. I said, I want full access to the Meridian files, not just the subsidiary accounts, the parent structure. If there's one person doing this, the conditions that allowed it exist somewhere in the architecture. That's a significant amount of access, he said. Yes, I said. It is. He was quiet. I waited. There are things in those files, he said carefully, that carry risk. I'm a forensic accountant, I said. Everything I touch carries risk. If I were afraid of that, I'd be doing taxes. He looked at me for a long moment. The compensation I mentioned at the gala, he said. Double it. I said, I want the access first. The money is secondary. He was quiet again, the particular quiet of someone recalibrating. That's not, he said slowly, what most people say. I'm not most people, I said. I'm a woman who fixes things that other people looked at and couldn't see. The money is compensation. The access is the work. I don't do work I can't finish. He looked at me for a long moment and I held it, the same way I held the gaze of boards and lawyers and executives, with the steadiness of someone who had learned that looking away was the thing they were waiting for. He said, Monday, 7 a.m. You'll have access to the parent structure. I'll want a workspace without traffic. Somewhere quiet. There's an office on the 12th floor that's been vacant for 6 months. That'll do, I said. I closed my laptop. I stood. I put on my coat and picked up my bag, and I was at the door when he said my name. Not Willa, not Miss Harmon, just my name, the whole of it, and something about the way he said it made me stop. I turned. He was still sitting on the edge of the desk. The window behind him had gone dark with early evening, and the city lights had started to come on behind him, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who controlled a great many things and had just handed one more of them over. He said, the Gala, Meridian. You understand what this is? I said, I understand what you're asking. And I already said yes. I left. On the drive home, the 401 moving east, the lake out of sight but present, the way it always was in this city, I let myself think about it properly for the first time, what I'd walked into, what I'd agreed to, what it meant that a man like Lucian Varro had stood in a room of 200 people and walked past all of them to stop in front of a woman in an iron-taped navy dress and say, I know what you do, not I know who you are, not I know your father, not I know your family or your history or your connections, what you do, like that was the thing that mattered, like that was the thing worth crossing a room for. The traffic slowed near the Scarborough interchange. I sat in it without impatience. I did the math in my head. 60 days of monitoring, the outflow pattern, the secondary structure I suspected existed somewhere in the architecture of Meridian that 3 audits hadn't found and I hadn't yet but would. I would. That was the thing Petra Sinclair had never once considered, standing in her green dress with her second glass of Riesling, speaking at the volume of someone who had never needed to lower their voice. She had looked at me and calculated absence. She had seen a woman in a plain dress at the edge of a room and seen someone who didn't count. She had been looking at the wrong numbers. There was a man in an office on Bay Street who was, at this moment, looking at a name on a notepad. He had trusted me with that name. He had trusted me with the access and the risk and the 60 days and the work. He had not asked me to smile while he did it. I merged onto the exit ramp and drove home through the dark, and I thought, This is what it costs to be the kind of woman who doesn't look away. And then I thought, good, I know how to pay.